Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ben Nobbs Thiessen. I am the Chair of Mennonite Studies here at the University of Winnipeg, and I am also the co-director for the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. Before I begin introducing this webinar and some of the events that we have planned in the future, I'd like to start off with a brief land acknowledgement and just recognizing that we are living and working here on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Shinanu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Métis nations on Treaty 1 territory. And particularly, I think as we prepare to reflect on the 150th anniversary of the Mennonite migration to Manitoba, we have a responsibility to consider that history and Mennonites' own roles in the settler colonial project in the Dominion of Canada. I'm very pleased to introduce this special webinar. This is our Manitoba Mennonite sesquicentennial or 150th series webinar. And the first webinar is with Eleanor Chornoboy, who I'll introduce in a second. We're glad to have her here giving a talk tonight called What Happened at Fort Dufferin. So exploring that very initial moment of arrival, perhaps as Mennonites, the 1870s Mennonites moved from being potential migrants or migrants to settlers on the land here in southern Manitoba. So a very sort of liminal transitional moment. So this webinar is the first of two webinars that we'll hold this summer. The second will be on August 27th. You might have seen the image of that, or you can find it on our CTMS website with Shalisa Clausen, who will talk to us about Mennonites' encounters with their new neighbors here in Manitoba. And both of these webinars, which we're co-hosting, and we're grateful to co-host with Mennonite Heritage Village, are kind of a build-up to events that we will have later this summer and into the fall. MHV will, of course, be holding an exhibition on the 1870s Mennonites, and then on October 4th and 5th of this year at the University of Winnipeg, but also live stream, we will have a two-day conference exploring many different aspects of the 1870s migration. So we've got a number, I think about 24 presentations, various presentations about all aspects of that history. So we hope you'll take a look at the conference program, which has just gone live on the CTMS website, ctms.uwinnipeg.ca. And you could register there as you do for past events and for this one to indicate your interest in attending. And if you are attending virtually, you'd also receive the live stream link when we get into October. So keeping an eye out for those events. And without further delay, then I'll take time now to introduce Eleanor. So since childhood, Eleanor was been captivated by stories shared by adults as they remembered the past. Her passion for preserving these stories resulted in two books of vignettes, FASPA and FASPA with Yath. In addition, she's published two heartwarming children's stories, Snow Angels and Pajama Tears. Her novel, Katerina, Mennonite Girl from Russia, is also a coming-of-age story about a young girl who triumphs over heartbreaking trials in the late 1800s as she leaves Russia to make a new home in Canada. Eleanor has written and performed solo productions, playing the roles of Mennonite women who work tirelessly in the home, on the farm, and in the community while raising large families. Her stories tell a piece of our past that typically does not appear in our history books. She's currently also trying to be helpful to her brother. I think she's putting it mildly there, Dale Hildebrandt, as he is producing and directing a documentary, Where the Cottonwoods Grow, about the 1870s Mennonite migration from Russia to Manitoba, which will be available in Manitoba later this summer or in early autumn. And it might be available to be shown, I think, at Mennonite Heritage Village and then also again at our fall conference. Eleanor, I know also from her role on the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society. She's had a long-standing role there. So Eleanor, without any further delay, I think I've said that a few times, I will turn it over to you now. You'll have some time for your talk about what happened at Fort Dufferin, and then we will monitor the Q&A so the audience can also post questions at any point during the chat. Try and use the Q&A button, and we'll look at those afterwards and have a little back and forth. So thank you, Eleanor. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, Ben. And thank you for all of you who are joining us tonight at this webinar. So I'm looking forward to learning more about Fort Dufferin, even from the questions and responses that I expect will be coming. So at the risk of sounding like a Manitoba tourism representative, I'll start off by pointing out a bit of information about Fort Dufferin. Fort Dufferin is now a National Historic Site of Canada. It's located 3 miles north of Emerson, Manitoba. And for those of you who are not familiar with Emerson, it's the border town on the 75 highway. Fort Dufferin can be found on the west bank of the Red River, and you can take a self-guided tour, and admission is free. And over the past few years, much work has been done to resurrect some of the buildings and to tell the story of its history. Marlon Emson, one of the committed volunteers, reported that they're currently working on completing the officers' mess kitchen. That's one of the many jobs that they're doing. My brother Dale, who Ben mentioned earlier, as working on a documentary, says that he and his young friends would pack up their cans of pork and beans and get on their bikes and camp at Fort Dufferin while some of the original buildings were still standing. For those of you who like to camp with more amenities than just a bike and probably a little tent, you can explore the fort, and there is a nearby campground called Prairie Oak Campground, and it's a short walk along a wooded trail from the campground to Fort Dufferin. Now, there were 2 main immigration facilities in Manitoba. The Shantz sheds, primarily used by the 1874 immigrants, and the camp of Fort Dufferin, which was primarily used a year later by the 1875 immigrants and those who came a few years later. Much has been written and told about the immigration sheds, often called the Shantz sheds, as I have already done. They were 4 immigration sheds contracted by Jacob Shantz, who was a Mennonite farmer, a businessman, and an industrialist from Ontario, who had been credited or has been credited for helping thousands of Mennonites from Russia immigrate to Manitoba. Shantz looked after the creation of the sheds in preparation for the 1874 arrival of Mennonites in the Mennonite East Reserve. That is east of the Red River, affectionately known as Yanseed by those of us who grew up on the west side of the Red River. Yes, I can already hear those from the east side saying, but you guys on the west side were the Yanseeders. It's an ongoing joke, and a Yanseeder means on the other side. Those sheds were intentionally built for the 1874 immigrants who typically landed at the confluence of the Red and Rat rivers. The Shantz sheds were located at the corners of 4 adjacent corner sections, about 7 miles east of the landing, which is near present-day Niverville. By the fall of 1875, Shantz had already dismantled 2 of the 4 sheds to build a general store or a warehouse in their place to permit storage of interim supplies while houses were being constructed by the new immigrants on the East Reserve. Just as an aside, if you're interested in Shantz's holdings, you might want to read a 2020 article by Bruce Wiebe in issue 41 of Preservings. It's entitled Shantz's Properties in Manitoba and Dakota. I think you might find that to be interesting reading. Shantz already anticipated that later arrivals from Russia would likely choose the newly opened second reserve west of the Red River. I say newly opened, but it took until 1876 when an order of council finally set this land aside for exclusive use by the Mennonites from Russia. It brought the total acreage of the two reserves to just over 500,000 acres. In contrast to the Shantz immigration housing, the facility at Fort Dufferin, where many 1875 and 1876 immigrants landed, was an immigration station that had been repurposed. It had been constructed along the west bank of the Red River, north of the current border station at Emerson, which is now known as Emerson Customs or Border Patrol. Originally, the camp had been designed to accommodate approximately 300 surveyors. It had been completed in the late fall of 1872. Like in many frontiers, saloons, brothels, and shacks soon popped up nearby. I found absolutely no record of any Mennonites frequenting these establishments. From 1872 to 1874, Fort Dufferin had been the winter headquarters and main supply base for the British-Canadian contingent of the International Boundary Commission, which had the task of surveying the international border along the 49th parallel. A contemporary description suggests that the camp itself consisted of a two-story frame building that was the officers' quarters, 3 one-story buildings, a large stable, a storehouse, a cookhouse, a bakery, a workshop, and a smith shop. After the surveyors moved west along the Boundary Commission Trail, the fort was used by the Northwest Mounted Police as an assembly point prior to their 1874 march to what is now Alberta. Then, from 1875 to 1879, Fort Dufferin was used by the Canadian government as an immigration station for steamboats entering Canada along the Red River from the United States. The boats carried thousands of Mennonites. At least 8 ships carrying 3,341 Mennonite passengers landed in Quebec between May and October in 1875. On their journey west from Quebec, when the 1875 Mennonites got as far as Ontario, they were welcomed by established Swiss Mennonites. The Swiss Mennonites, who had arrived in Canada in the late 1700s, offered to buy cows for the Mennonites heading for Fort Dufferin. If a few men would stay back to drive the cattle to Manitoba, the Swiss Mennonites offered to buy a herd for them. This may seem a little bit out of context, but I'm going to get back to this later on in my story. Although Fort Dufferin was not exclusively intended for Mennonites, Mennonites were by far the majority of people who occupied the fort for a significant period of time. In July 1875, the earliest Mennonite villagers who had moved to what would be the West Reserve disembarked at Fort Dufferin, south of the confluence of the Rat and Red Rivers. Many of these passengers joined friends and relatives on the East Reserve, but approximately 1,000 people destined to move to the west of the river quickly crowded the immigration sheds at Fort Dufferin, surpassing the intended capacity of 300 people. The reason for the Mennonites going to the west of the Red River is that most of the arable land on the East Reserve had been taken by the settlers who had arrived in 1874. And the land that had not been taken was not deemed suitable for farming by those Mennonites. Prior to the onslaught of the 1875 arrival of Mennonites, Shantz, who had anticipated the need for additional land, arranged for himself, his brother Abram, a Métis driver, a Métis surveyor, and 3 of the earlier settlers to explore the area west of the Red River to assess its suitability for the newest settlers arriving in 75. Shantz liked what he saw, but when this land was recommended to the newcomers upon their arrival at Fort Dufferin, they resisted the notion of settling on the open plains. At the time of their arrival, the open prairie was not highly regarded by most of the existing Anglo settlers, who were dependent upon ample supplies of wood and running water. By running water, I mean rivers and streams, not taps. Now, the Anglo-Saxons, or the Anglos, had already rejected land in that area in favor of what they considered to be better land, and the Mennonites may have been made aware of that. The immigrants wanted wooded lands or river lots, but other settler groups or native residents of the province had staked out most of these already. So again, Shantz, but this time with Hespeler, the immigration agent, and Mennonite leaders from the 1875 migration went to inspect the land west of the Red River. Their primary considerations, according to Peter Zacharias, when assessing the land would have been the lay of the land, the natural drainage patterns, access to water for human and livestock consumption, how suitable the soil was for agriculture, access to lumber, and the proximity of the villages to be constructed to each other. They were led to consider the grassy and, to a degree, swampy open prairie just north of the international border and lying between Emerson on the Red River and Mountain City, which is south of present-day Morden, near the Pembina Hills. It is said that the distance between Emerson and Mountain City was 1 day's horse ride. It was agreed that the land was excellent, but they still had concerns about easy access to wood for building houses and for firewood, and access to hay for animal feed, as well as access to water. Some of the leaders wanted to look elsewhere, but Shantz and Hespeler advised them that it would be impossible to find another suitable tract of land for block settlement. Block settlement is a type of land distribution which allows settlers with the same ethnicity to form small colonies, such as was allowed in the East Reserve. Shantz and Hespeler assured them that the land could be reserved for them, including the timber areas along the Pembina River. The immigrants consented to the land and proceeded with surveying and determined where the villages would be. After 6 weeks absent from Fort Dufferin, the men returned to their people who had been waiting for them for what must have seemed an endless wait. Since the Mennonites arrived at Fort Dufferin in July and the surveying party was away until well into August, it was clear that there would be no time to put in or grow a crop that year. While the surveying team was away, life in Fort Dufferin was a very challenging time. Children were dying. People were getting sick. Mothers were worried that they did not have enough milk to feed their little ones. They waited and waited for the cattle from the Ontario Swiss Mennonites, the ones that they had promised. It was a mother's hope that the cow milk might give their children some nourishment. When the cattle finally arrived, young Jacob Fair, who had arrived in Canada July 6, 1875, and had landed at Fort Dufferin with his parents and 5 siblings, wrote in his memoirs describing the joy and the sadness. He wrote, "The cattle arrived, and there was great joy, especially for the mothers who had to take care of the sick children. To a degree, This necessary supplement rejuvenated the children. But the sadness of the time was not completely taken away. There was still a yearning for the true friends which had to be left behind, for the beautiful Heimat with its precious orchards. Not only were they tired, hungry, and sick, but they were also homesick for what they had left behind. Jacob had chronicled the family's journey and also described the conditions at Fort Dufferin as saying, "There was little elbow room and many sick children. One after the other, they passed into eternity. There was a funeral every day. Frequent funerals were a grim routine with infections spreading easily. The lack of recorded data makes it probable that cholera or diphtheria and malnutrition were significant contributors to the high child mortality rate. 30 children died at Fort Dufferin. Included in that list was Jacob Fair's infant brother, Isaac, who died on the 29th of July, 1875, at the age of 1 year, 8 months, and 18 days, 23 days after he arrived in Canada. He left to be remembered by his father, his pregnant mother, and his siblings. But there was not time for mourning. They had to bury little Isaac and be ready to move west. The children were buried at or near Fort Dufferin during the immigrants' 6-week stay. The graves may have been marked at the time, but to date, the exact whereabouts in the Fort Dufferin area are yet unknown. Jacob Fair's journal noted, "We spent 6 weeks at this place of mourning till we could finally start out and set our foot on our own land." During that 6-week wait, while the small group of men were assessing the land and they're surveying potential villages, this time at Fort Dufferin became important to the future development of the Western settlement in other ways. The new immigrants at Fort Dufferin came from several colonies, primarily from Fürstenland, a Pacht colony, a colony of rented land, and Chortica, a well-established colony in Russia. And they came from a dozen or more villages in southern Russia. For them, all to become one community was a key factor. Excuse me. Of those new immigrants, 2 people are recorded in the history books as individuals who played a significant role in the development of the West Reserve. As a consequence of the decisions made at Fort Dufferin, they were Ältester Johann Wiebe and Isaac Mueller. When Wiebe arrived, he is quoted as saying, "Praise God, early Monday morning, July 14, we reached the immigration sheds at Dufferin, a few miles north of the international boundary. Here we already met many of our brethren and sisters in Christ who came to greet us and who had departed from Russia 1 week and 2 weeks before we left." 38-year-old Ältester Johann Wiebe had been the Ältester of the Fürstenland Gemeinde for 5 years, and he had previously called a brotherhood meeting at Alexandertal in Fürstenland to discuss immigration. Once at Fort Dufferin, he saw the need for church organization and colony administration. Again, he called a brotherhood meeting, this time at Fort Dufferin. He gathered the settlers who had come from different church bodies in their homeland to organize the new church, to establish its goals, and to set its direction. Wiebe understood that to unify the Mennonites from the different villages and colonies, under one church would be difficult, and that the blending process should begin immediately. He saw this as an opportunity to reestablish church according to the model of the early Christian church in the New Testament. He strongly believed that the church had been wrong in using corporal punishment with believers, a role that belonged to the state. He wanted to apply church discipline instead. He wanted a colony administered on the Russian Mennonite model, but he strongly opposed the practice that colony officials physically punish wrongdoers, as had been the case in Russia. At the meeting called by Wiebe, groundwork for church organization and colony administration was laid out. Wiebe advised close collaboration between civic administration and the Gemeinde. He promoted the notion that an Obervorsteher, who would be like a chief superintendent or a head of the community government, what we might call a reeve today. He elected to assist the church to lead and govern according to a Christian order. There at Fort Dufferin, he was confirmed as the Älteste of the new church born in the Fort Dufferin immigration sheds. Henceforth, the church would be known as the Rheinländer Mennonitengemeinde, later known as Altkolonier or Old Colony Mennonite Church. The second man was Isaac Mueller. He'd arrived in Quebec on the SS Quebec a week after Wiebe. Leadership would be key. It is likely that the 51-year-old Mueller was chosen as the Obervorsteher while still at Fort Dufferin. Some historians have written that Mueller had also occupied the role of Vortitza. Once elected as Obervorsteher at Fort Dufferin, Mueller divided groups of 15 to 20 families for each new village. Now, this number 15 to 20 varies a bit from the different people who have written about this situation, but no more than 30 anyway, I'd say. During Mueller's 11 years as Obervorsteher, there was no issue on which he and Älteste Wiebe publicly disagreed. Soon after the surveying team arrived back at Fort Dufferin, the new immigrants moved to their homesteads on the West Reserve to begin establishing their new villages. 18 villages put down roots on the western part of the reserve the summer of 1875. In the summer of 1876, 147 more families arrived at Fort Dufferin and joined the villages. Almost overnight, the prairie became dotted with villages in the pattern of settlement the Mennonites had known in South Russia. Fort Dufferin's role as immigration station ended when boats on the Red River were no longer the main mode of transport for immigrants to Manitoba. On December 3rd, 1878, the last spike was driven to complete the first railway line from St. Boniface to the international boundary of Emerson, connecting Manitoba to eastern Canada by rail through the United States. Gradually, the historical significance of Fort Dufferin faded. Fortunately, though, through the hard work of the Emerson-based Post Road Heritage Group and many volunteers, it is gaining much deserved recognition. Today, many Mennonites on the West Reserve and many parts of Canada, and probably many parts of the world, can trace their roots back to that period of Fort Dufferin. Thank you for joining me, and please know that you are always welcome at Fort Dufferin to learn and to remember. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for that lovely presentation. We have the comments are coming in the chat as well. Feel free to to note that terrific presentation. Says one of the members there, and I just would note that if you can't see it, we've had about 100 people listening in for this talk as well. So thanks everyone for coming in. As we're competing with the Stanley Cup game of all things on this particular night, I think. So I think that's a pretty high compliment to you, at least in the Manitoba context. And I'll remind folks that you can pop your questions into the Q&A, the little Q&A button there if you have one for Eleanor. In a really kind of timely moment, just seconds before you mentioned Eltesta Johan Wiebe, Tina Siemens had written that he had landed there as well, and mentioned that she has the booklet that he wrote about the journey, the one that you then cited just moments later. So we'll wait a little bit to see if we have some additional questions in the Q&A, and please do feel free to post there. This is a really fascinating subject, Eleanor, and I like how you cover kind of the memory or the childhood memories of Fort Dufferin from your brother, kind of as a place of leisure, and then take us back through the history, and then return to kind of the preservation of the space in the present. And I can't help but think, kind of having looked at migration to many places throughout the Americas at the same time period, Fort Dufferin is kind of a contemporary to other kind of migration stations and migration hotels. We know immigration agents were kind of competing between different countries for migrants like Mennonites. And at the same moment that, 1,000 Mennonites would descend on this unlikely spot on the Red River, we would have thousands of migrants being processed through immigrant hotels in places as far-flung as Sao Paulo in Brazil, or in Buenos Aires in Argentina. In those same years, I was looking for the date, I think just a couple years later, in Brazil, they constructed a multi-thousand person immigration hotel kind of quarantine station. So yeah, this was a moment in time of rapid kind of mass migration and expansion, and you really kind of hone in on the significance of Fort Dufferin within that. One question that came to mind, I was looking at an article today that talks about the ongoing kind of cross-border significance between Manitoba and Dakota / Minnesota. Can you talk a little bit more about that in this context of Fort Dufferin? Obviously, the migrants were arriving, as you said, by steamboat. Were they pulling supplies as well and making purchases through steamboat from places like Fargo or as far down as Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Yes, they were. They were purchasing a lot of stuff. At one point, some of the folks had been advised that if they wanted to have any supplies, then they'd better buy it in the Fargo or some of the American places, because they said that Manitoba was a complete desolate place and there was nothing to be had. So they better buy in the States before they come back here. They bought sometimes implements, different kinds of tools. Those are primarily the things that they bought that I'm aware of. Probably some foodstuffs if they thought, like flour, for example, but for the most part, it would be implements, some household items, and that sort of thing that they would stock up on.
Okay, yeah. I was looking at another stat and trying to do the conversion, but I think maybe the group that came earlier to the East Reserve, I think arrived in Winnipeg, and just in a sort of spree of spending, right? The first group, as I understand, was also the wealthiest of the bunch, and spent, I think, equivalent to almost $500,000 in today's value. I'd have to go back for what the number was then in just a short period. So I'm sure there were many merchants who were actively competing to see those dollars spent on the Canadian side as opposed to the US side.
Yeah, and my understanding too is in Winnipeg they also bought livestock and farm implements, as well as wagons and such.
Okay, and I'm looking now. We do have a couple questions coming in, so thanks, folks. Dennis Zimmerman writes, was there a group that came around 1902, as that was about when my great-grandfather and his family came to Winkler?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question, Ben.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Dennis asks if you're familiar with a group that might have come around a little bit later than these migrants, around 1902, so around the turn of the century. He says he thinks this is when his great-grandfather and his family came to Winkler.
I don't know. I know there were several more migrations and people kept trickling in at different times, but I don't know about a 1902 migration. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. And then we have a question from Robert Martins, who just writes that immigration was, it sounds like a brutal experience. What do you think was the primary motivation that kept these folks going? And do you have any idea if some of them may have given up and moved south, perhaps joined those US bound migrants who opted for a slightly warmer climate and better transport connections?
Some did. Some did move to the south. A lot of people, the reason they came to Manitoba was because of in Canada, they were promised that they would not have to be a part of the military. And the people did not get that assurance in the States. It was suggested that it might happen for them, but they were not confident that they would be exempt from military conscription. And so, and yet some people did move to the States for a better climate.
Yeah, I can imagine that the experience you said, especially the sort of tragic deaths that took place in the burials would have been particularly discouraging for these migrants. And as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking of other contexts in which Mennonites have migrated, for instance, those that traveled to Paraguay, in 1926, 27, and spent, months, more than a year kind of waiting, again, in a similar kind of space, right? Yes. A liminal space, Puerto Casala, waiting for land to be surveyed and experiencing epidemic disease as well in that context, and having to bury children in particular.
Yeah, and the time for any of the immigrants, particularly women, I say particularly women, maybe because I am a woman, but it was so incredibly hard for them. And yet there are very few reports of people ever returning to Russia. They made a commitment, and a lot of them had sold. There was no way back because they'd sold what they had. But it was a very difficult time for them. They didn't have the housing, they didn't have water. There were just so many needs that they had that couldn't be met as quickly as they needed it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have a question here from Dennis Schellenberg, referring back to something else that you'd mentioned, the presence of the Northwest Mounted Police at Fort Dufferin. So he'd just like to know a little bit more about the reason for this. Were they there to basically kind of exert control over the region on behalf of the government? I know in some cases this was a transitory presence. So I wonder, perhaps Dennis is wondering if they remained there in addition to those that then headed west, which you mentioned.
Yeah, they headed west, presumably, or the reasoning was that they were going to bring law and order into the West. There had been an uprising, and so the police wanted to have a presence there and settle things down. I don't know the degree of how difficult it was, or whether it was, some, opportunities to put pressure, and, I don't know whether that was part of some other reasoning, but the word was it was to settle the West and bring in law and order.
And pretty striking that in a few short years we had again, this Northwest Manitoba Police sort of staging their march, their so-called March West out of Fort Dufferin. We had a boundary commission preceding them, mapping out the territorial divide, groups of settlers, and then I believe was there a short period of time where this was used as a quarantine station for incoming cattle as well.
Yes, it was. After the Mennonites left, it was a quarantine station for a period of time. Mm-hmm. And then slowly the buildings disintegrated, and there were bits and pieces, but there's been a lot of work that has been done, and you'll still see considerable divots in the ground that are probably the size of a good sized barn, where evidently there were cattle stored, not underground, but at least it was somewhat subterranean. And so you can still see that there.
Another question we have, Eugene Jansen asks, he says this is a very relevant topic even today. This story from 150 years ago. He asks, is the material you examined to tell this story, does it tell anything about Mennonites' relationship with Indigenous neighbors in this region while they were at Fort Dufferin?
That's a very good question, and I've asked that of a lot of people, and I wasn't able to find anything in the research, and yet I've certainly heard stories, been told stories. An aunt of mine tells me stories about her grandmother, who was one of the first midwives, certainly learned from Indigenous women, learned about medicines that come, in the natural habitat, what plants to use for different medicinal reasons, and they shared information. But the people from Fort Dufferin, I wasn't able to find any record of that, and goodness knows I looked. And particularly because the Roseau River Reserve is right near Fort Dufferin. There must have been a certain amount of interaction, even if it's as minimal as saying hello or some kind of a greeting. And yet there were Métis people who helped with the surveying. So we know that, but that's as much as I was able to glean.
Right, I've got a couple more questions here. Don't have the name of the author of this question, so I'll just group them together. First of all, who had title to the land that was purchased here? Did the church collectively hold the title as those villages were created in the West Reserve? And then the other question they had, which we've already touched on a little bit, did the immigrants come with substantial money of their own to help them get through these first difficult months and years?
I'll speak to the title first, and then why don't I just talk about the money? They did have money to buy some necessities, and they also helped each other out an awful lot. And that was part of the reason for the villages. There's so much collaborative work being done that, they, until this very recently, there were still the bees, the barn building bees and the pig killing bees, and women back and forth sharing seeds and doing things together, whether it's like a quilting bee, for example. So that doesn't totally speak to the question, but the title, it was a lot of the villages were came under one title, and so if somebody wanted to sell, they could only sell to a relative or pass it on to a relative for the time being. Now that tradition didn't last all that long, as people started going out of the land, out into the land and buying property outside of the villages. So unraveling some of that has been, I believe, quite difficult to, who you had, you might have had a yard and a piece of land that you worked, but it was all under the title of the village.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I've answered that question.
Certainly, and I think you were going to speak a little bit more to the money factor as well.
Money factor, yeah, they did have some money, and they did help each other, and because they still needed to buy things here, and I know that some of them got very little for their land that they sold in Russia, but they did have some land, and they also borrowed money. And that was one of Isaac Mueller's major accomplishments, was paying off the debt that the Mennonites had incurred, and they did that in record time. Matter of fact, I think it was a bit of a point of pride, having paid off their debt so quickly.
Would this be the debt you're referring to, or the money that was offered by Ontario Mennonites, or
Ontario Mennonite? Well, I believe more the government, but I often get those different debts confused, so forgive me for that.
I think I've seen a couple other questions and a few popped into the chat, so I'm just trying to monitor them at the same time. One was fairly straightforward. What was the maximum number of Mennonite settlers that would have been present at Fort Dufferin at one time, do you think?
I think it sounded like it's very, I have, first of all, confession, I don't have that information because I looked for it and couldn't find it. But it sounds like it was very, very crowded, but at any given time, there could have been up to 1,000 people, because there were also, I believe they also set up some tents. But they didn't all arrive at once, but they didn't leave other than going to the East Reserve until they went to the West Reserve. Like, there were a lot of people who went to the East Reserve, but 1,000 still stayed over at the Fort Dufferin.
Okay, and that you kind of led us into one of the other questions, which I think disappeared for a second in the chat. But what was the sort of back and forth we might have had between West Reserve and East Reserve at this point in time? And someone else had kind of asked this too. We know that some people had left the East Reserve because of the quality of land and came to the West.
Yes.
Are there interactions as well that would have been going on between these two settlements areas?
Yes, there was visiting back and forth. And like you say, there were many people who moved from the East Reserve to the West Reserve for better land. And also, there would have been family members, or there were family members who, some lived on the East Reserve and some lived on the West Reserve. And there's certainly visiting that went back and forth. And so there was ongoing visiting back and forth, although it wasn't easy, because to cross the Red River, there were ferries, but it also was a long time. The travel wasn't easy. The post road only came a year or two later, and even that was, you'd have to go by ox cart or by horse, and it was no easy feat to visit back and forth. And of course, they didn't have minivans either. So if you had a number of children, you'd have to pack them pretty closely, or just take a few at a time.
Yeah. So speaking with a woman who grew up in Bolivia today, and she said, she was one of 14 children, and she said it was always a treat when she would, the father, when they would travel into the closest big city, Santa Cruz, would select one or two of the children to come along each time. So yeah, it was, he wouldn't bring everyone at once. So.
I imagine so.
Yeah. we're kind of getting a little bit close to the end of our session here. We have a few more minutes, so I'll keep an eye out for other questions in the chat. I also wanted to ask you, Eleanor, what's changed, do you think, or has anything changed? I shouldn't ask a leading question, in the way that this history is told and related to, compared to maybe the way it would have been thought of in earlier years. Has there been a greater attempt to preserve this, a greater awareness, or has it decreased perhaps as some connections through oral histories, right? You mentioned, your aunt recounting histories from, her grandmother about this.
Yeah. That's a tough question because I think it's so individual. From my perspective, I think there's a lot more interest. But that's because I'm more interested, perhaps. And I get a lot of questions from family members asking about different things, and they want to know where they were from, and so I think there's more interest and more detailed interest, but it's also I think there's a lot more interest, and I think Shalisa will be talking about that, is what was our relationship with the indigenous people, and how were we, there's always different ways of looking at things. So what's our responsibility now, and are we doing enough to ameliorate possibly some of the damage we've done? Have we done it? I think Shalisa will certainly respond to that, because we certainly, were we pawns of the government in terms of occupying the land, as opposed to not being that? I think historians have to grapple with that, and I know some of them are. You are, Ben, right?
I was thinking about the term pawns. Was even a phrase used to sometimes describe a new wave of Mennonites that would go to the Chaco in the 1920s, and in newspaper articles at the time that looked at the history of the Chaco War. So certainly that's something that we should be considering. Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Just looking to see if there's anything else we could try out here. I think there was a couple questions just asking about moments of departure from villages in present-day Ukraine and the Russian Empire, and kind of points of arrival. And maybe as a way of kind of wrapping us up, Eleanor, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that trajectory would look like? I was kind of running back through some articles today, the typical points of passage that Mennonites would have made that would have taken them to Fort Dufferin, out of the villages they left. What would have been some of those stops?
Wow, there were different routes that were taken. I look at the map, and they stopped at different places in Russia, and some of them went through the Baltic states, some of them went via went to Germany and ended up in England and ended up in Quebec, and then from Quebec to Ontario, and then over the Great Lakes into parts of the States, and then they came to Manitoba. So there were just, I don't have a picture in my head right now of the actual routes that were taken, but there were, depending on what part of Imperial Russia that they were living in, would dictate it, but also it wasn't easy always to get out of Russia. They had to get their passports, and some of that I imagine would have determined when the ships were going and that sort of thing. So there was just so many ports, and they ended up in Germany for quite a while and ended up in immigration places in Germany, and they took so many different types of transportation. When they first left their villages, they would go by being pulled by horses and end up at the train station, and many of them had never been in a train before. And you know, they had so much luggage initially, and then from the train station they would go on a boat, and then they'd end up in another train in England, and there would just be so many off and on points that it just made it for a really, really long journey. So, and then of course the ships, when they came to as far as Quebec or Halifax, it was their first time seeing icebergs, and then getting onto another train from one place to another, which makes me think about all the luggage that they had. And initially, they packed a lot of their luggage into large wooden chests that you see in museums right now, which are very heavy. And at one point, there was one gentleman who wrote back to Russia and saying, you know, don't do that anymore because it's so expensive. The chest is more expensive, or as expensive as all the stuff inside in terms of the cost of shipping it. So some of them adopted using large sacks that they would send their stuff in, but I'm sure that wasn't appreciated by some people who had delicate items they wanted to bring over.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, it's astonishing for me to think about stitching together all these different types of transportation and kind of following these different, not even just one route, but multiple routes and transportation networks. I was reading, I think, if I don't have this wrong, in the groups that were coming through Sarnia by steamboat through the Great Lakes and into Duluth. A few arrived, as there was sort of onshore ice that prevented them from getting into the harbor. And I think some, after waiting for days out on the water without much food, actually walked across the ice onto the shore.
Yes, and some of them were on the boat so long they had to go into their resources, even to use their seed potatoes that they had brought with them to plant in Manitoba, and they had some food but they had to share it with everybody, and they weren't just all Mennonites on those boats, and it was very, very critical. And also just in terms of things that were packed, that they took what was absolutely necessary, but there would often be some precious things that they would take, and Quaker clocks were one of those items that some people were able to bring with them, and certainly you see them in museums, and I know a few homes who have them as well.
There we go.
There you go. Nice.
Couldn't resist that one. My alarm just went off, Eleanor, reminding me that we do have to end this wonderful webinar. So I just want to express my gratitude to you for taking part in this and for really getting us started as we prepare to think in many ways about the sesquicentennial in coming months. So I hope folks will take advantage of the displays, which should be up soon, I imagine, at Mennonite Heritage Village. And I want to thank them as well for hosting this with us, and direct you to our next webinar in our series with Shalisa on August 27th, and then eventually to our conference. So we'll certainly continue to discuss this in the period going forward. And there's just a number of thank yous and appreciation being shared in the chat here. So thanks a lot, Eleanor. And thank you to everyone for attending.